Welcome to Music and Medicine on Monday, a collaboration between the School of Music and the College of Medicine at the University of Iowa. This podcast is designed to help musicians play and to stay healthy. Video of this is supplemented on the Iowa Protocols, which is a free medical website available at the QR code or the web link that's positioned below. We're coming to you from the recital hall at the beautiful Voxman School of Music in Iowa City, Iowa. My name is Harry Hoffman, and I'm a physician at the University of Iowa. And I'd like to introduce our featured guest performer, Kobe Schneblin, a fourth-year double major in accounting and trombone performance at the University of Iowa. Today's episode addresses playing the trombone with a focus on healthy technique and a special emphasis on the embouchure and concerns about dystonia. With us today are Kobe's mentor, Jonathan Allen, professor of trombone at the University of Iowa, and Dr. Chris Groth, a neurologist at the University of Iowa with a special focus on movement disorders and management of dystonia. Kobe, before you play your piece, can you tell us what drew you into a career as a musician, how you came to play the trombone, a little bit about the instrument that you have with you there, and then a little bit about the piece of music that you've chosen and why you chose it?
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit what got me into music in the first place. So it goes back all the way to 5th grade when you choose your instrument in elementary school and you're presented with all these different options and everything. And so I was like kind of overwhelmed, like, oh, look at all these instruments. And going into it, originally I wanted to do percussion or saxophone as like going as a 5th grader. Turns out I was really bad at keeping a beat, so drumming was off the table. And saxophone, I wasn't very good at that either. So it turned out that trombone was what my band director suggested that I play, and so that's the instrument I went with. And also my older brother and sister, I'm the middle of 5, but my older brother and sister played the trumpet and clarinet, and so I was like, I can't choose those two either, and so I'm like, I'm gonna play trombone, I'm gonna be unique with the slide and everything. 7th and 8th grade was the first time that I really thought that I really started to enjoy music, and it was something I was really passionate about. And the main reason for that was because of jazz band. And I learned that through the music genre of jazz is that there's so much free improvisation of notes that are off the page. You actually come up with ideas in your head and you play them on your instrument. And so as a 7th grader, I was like, oh, that's super cool. Like I can just create on the fly and everything like that. And obviously I wasn't very good at it back then. But yeah, that was kind of the first driving factor. And then going out throughout high school, I continued to practice more and more. And when I got to senior year of high school, I was like, I think I want to try and make a professional career out of music. So here I am studying at the University of Iowa, trying to pursue that career right now. And so, but yeah, kind of hinge off of that, why I chose the trombone specifically and what makes it kind of unique from other instruments. The one thing that makes trombone unique from other instruments is the capability of the slide, right? That's kind of the first thing that everyone looks at. But the way I view it, it's the only instrument that's made that most resembles the voice. So when you've got the voice, you can kind of do like up and down slurs without having to like notch into pitches. The trombone is the same way, and you can like gliss in between pitches, and it very much employs that level of inflection that a lot of vocalists have. And to me, like when I'm playing the trombone, it's just an extension of my voice. And so that's, especially like as I started to practice more and getting to college and everything, that's been something I've been trying to explore more as an extension of my voice there. And then to answer your last question as well, my instrument that I play, so I actually play a custom Edwards trombone. So Edwards is a custom trombone company that they make trombones in Elkhorn, Wisconsin. It's about 3.5 hours away here from Iowa City. I also play on a Grego 60 mouthpiece. They're made by Christian Grego, and so that's the instrument that I'm playing today.
So Kobe, can you tell us a little bit about the piece you chose to play?
Yeah, so the piece that I'm playing today is Guy Ropart's piece in E-flat minor. And I prepared this piece for one of the ITF International Trombone Festival competitions, the Robert Marceller 22 and under competition this year. I recorded it about a month ago, and I'll hear back on results on that in early January. So
terrific.
Yeah.
We look forward to hearing it.
Yes, thank you.
That was great, Colby. Before proceeding with some comments from Chris, I'd like Jonathan to discuss Colby's performance in the context of some of the physical challenges faced by wind instrument players with a focus on the embouchure. Maybe you or Colby could define embouchure for me. I looked it up and saw there's no real consensus on what exactly is the embouchure. Do you want to field that question?
Sure, I can talk about that a little bit. Embouchure is a term that we use to describe the muscles that need to be engaged in order to buzz the lips to make a sound on the brass instrument. And what an embouchure differs for all the different wind instruments because you have to make a different shape. One thing that I think is important, like pedagogically, that we tell the students is that an embouchure doesn't exist unless air is flowing through the lips. So you can't just like distort your face and kind of make an embouchure. And I think pedagogically that's really important. It's a very loose definition, but it's basically a certain amount of work needs to be done by the face muscles in order to make a sound on a brass instrument. And we try to do just enough work necessary, but not more so that we're not overusing the muscles.
Great. And so there are a lot of articles written about losing the lip, musicians' dystonia as it applies to the embouchure. And maybe, Chris, if you want to take over and just give us a little background, a little history about dystonias and how it might apply.
Absolutely. Dystonias are, by nature, a brain disorder where the brain and its ability to communicate out with the muscles that control our body becomes disorganized. Dystonias can present in a complete variability of different ways. If you have a muscle, it can develop dystonia. So you can develop the most common form of dystonia. It affects the neck. But you can also develop dystonias that affect the eyes, the jaw, the lips, the hands. And so when we think of musicians' dystonias, of which embouchure dystonia is a part of it, those are coined typically what we call focal dystonias or task-specific dystonias. And so what we know is that people who have certain types of dystonias, the dystonia can present for no particular reason whatsoever, but there are other times that we have dystonias that do develop because of maybe some inciting incident. For some things, it can be a traumatic episode, so maybe a car accident leading to development of dystonia. But we also know that some dystonias seem to be linked to use or potentially overuse, which is where we get into this musician's dystonia question. Musicians spend hours and hours of their life practicing a very repetitive, similar action over and over again, and there can be this potential development for an abnormal response of the brain then to that very specific action. We think about this in a couple different ways. One is this idea of plasticity, where the brain takes information in and then it tries to reconfigure or determine what it will do with it, how it will respond to it. There's also this idea of what's called inhibition. Our brains work in this idea of kind of stop and go, either do something or don't do something on the most basic level. And we think of with dystonias, we have this problem where we have an inappropriate amount of inhibition. So there's too much excitation, too much go signal, which gets a little bit to some of the treatments that you might use for certain types of dystonias. Another idea that people talk about is something called this sensor-motor kind of feedback, where essentially the actions that you do, your body listens to it, sees what's going on, and tries to give a response back to it. And you can get this inappropriate response between taking into your brain and then what your brain interprets out from it. And so then this is kind of the basics idea of what we think dystonias are. At the end of the day, they're not things that you can cut open a brain and see the problem. These are more commonly thought of as almost like a software issue with the way that the brain's communicating amongst itself, as opposed to some sort of hardware issue where you've lost brain cells or you've had some sort of stroke or loss or death of a brain cell. And so it's a very kind of complicated idea, which gets into sometimes what we do to try and use different treatments for different types of dystonias.
I understand that the history of dystonias has changed a little across the decades. At one point it was considered a psychiatric or a muscle imbalance or some other non-neurologic problems. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so dystonias by nature most commonly affect women. And unfortunately within history of medicine and society, conditions that primarily affected women were not given as much credence. And so it was really not until really well into the 1900s that people started to say that this wasn't some sort of made-up disease or some sort of made-up process or fate conditions, that these were truly neurologic disorders. And some of it was even kind of a backwards way, that we found genetic disorders that ran in families of people with certain dystonias, and started to realize that these were not made up, these were very real conditions that people were experiencing. And some of it stems from the fact that it's such a, sometimes almost a bizarre type of thing to think that someone who could have played an instrument for decades now suddenly cannot for certain reasons with muscle tension or tightness or abnormal lip movements. It doesn't make sense per se, especially when you're thinking about it from, times in the past. And so more recently, we've kind of better understood how it works, and through both genetics as well as through new kind of brain imaging technologies.
So maybe before we get into the workup and the treatment of it, we can ask Jonathan to give some perspective from a musician about embouchure dystonia.
Sure. If you talk to 10 different brass musicians about focal dystonia, you'll get 10 different answers. And some of it is what Dr. Groth was talking about, how some people believe it's an emotional disorder, even still for like focal dystonia. Some people believe it's a technique problem, that you need to fix your technique in order to solve the problem. Some people believe there's nothing you can do and there's no chance to recover. And so there's then several people have developed different retraining or kind of recovery techniques. And so there's lots of different angles people are coming from. And there doesn't seem to be any kind of one kind of codified or definitive way that we can really treat this.
So I've seen some series that quoted even a 10% incidence of developing embouchure dystonia. And I understand that you've been very successful in helping prevent that from occurring in your students. And is there some techniques you can describe in the context of Colby's performance that you can apply?
Sure. I hope I'm being successful in preventing dystonias. I had my own embouchure kind of issues several years ago pop up, where mine started with like a quiver on one side of the mouth, and then within a couple days, it kind of shifted to like the whole mouth, and then within about 2 or 3 weeks, I wasn't able to play at all. So in my own personal experience, my own journey, I studied lots of the people who help people retrain from dystonias, and so I kind of got bits and pieces from a lot of the different angles. So I'm kind of in the middle, I feel like, of all of these different things. And so that's kind of my perspective, and I've changed the way that I teach the instrument in a lot of ways to hopefully kind of find a path that hopefully in 10 or 20 years we can see the results of that. Unfortunately, it's a really long path to know if it's being successful, but I feel like at least now, having gone through some of what I've been able to catch some things that could be problematic in the future. So now to talk about kind of Colby, the reason I asked Colby to play, besides being a wonderful musician and just sounding great, is that this semester we discovered something that we hadn't noticed before. So when we talk about articulation, which is starting a note in music, usually on a brass instrument, it's a ta syllable or a da syllable or some variation of that. And Colby, probably since he was the first time he ever played the instrument, was making that basic ta or da syllable, but he was also closing his lips every time he started a note. So he was doing a ta and a pa at the same time. And if you do that really on purpose, it's kind of really hard to do, but a lot of brass players do it. I've recently learned that there are some people who actually teach kind of that methodology, and well, we can deal with that later, I guess. So this is a really kind of difficult thing to kind of uncouple, right? Because we don't have a really successful way to teach beginning brass instruments. They typically start when they're in Iowa, 5th grade. They start beginning band in 5th or 6th grade here. And it's a whole classroom full of people, and the band director doesn't have time to kind of work with every one-on-one, and it's not very common for beginning brass musicians to start with a private instructor. It's usually not until late in high school or even in college for some people. So we don't really have a successful way of like catching that early on. So in Colby's performance today, most of it sounded great, but there were a couple instances, right? So can you talk about like what type of instances where it still kind of wants to fire?
Yeah, so especially like when it happens, it's kind of like a closing off of the embouchure, which is caused by a lot of tension, which is what we found. And so the times when it's working well is when I'm staying nice and open, I'm being very conscious about it. But as I start to go up and down the horn vertically, then going into the low range as well, it's wanting to close off to that more paw articulation. And as can be referenced, the tone starts to suffer a little bit, and note accuracy is a little bit not quite as consistent as it used to be either. So
An aperture can kind of be similar to like the aperture on a camera, although we don't close in a rotational way like a camera does. But as we get higher, we need the aperture to be much smaller, and we get into the low range, the aperture needs to be much larger. So we're not only navigating physically changing the shape and size of our instrument with the trombone slide, but we're constantly adjusting the lip muscles and all the muscles around the mouth to change the size and shape and the focus of that embouchure. So as Colby, especially, I feel like it's in the high range, like F above the staff, the aperture starts getting very, very small, and the likelihood of getting one of those kind of closing off or like a puh seems to be higher, especially if you're using the tongue a lot, articulating that part of the piece. It seems a little bit more likely. So one thing that we've worked on for that is just a lot of what we call air articulations. So we're starting notes without any tongue or with the aperture open, very conscious, just moving air into the instrument. And sometimes no note sounds at all. We're just moving air into the instrument with no sound, just getting the sensation, the feeling of that openness. And that's been really successful. Have other things that have been successful?
yeah, the air attacks have been really successful, and it was funny, like when we first noticed it in my lesson, I think it was about a month ago, I like played another piece of music and like my sound completely changed. I didn't know I could sound like that. And then I was like, okay, like I can actually like feel when I'm doing this sensation. I can feel like when I'm reverting back to old habits as well. So a lot of the air attacks have really helped. I've also worked on what are called lip slurs, which is blowing air going through up and down the instrument, and making sure that the embouchure is not causing a lot of tension and just trying to stay nice, relaxed, working up and down the horn.
So Colby, have you heard of the term losing the lip, and have you been aware of that potential problem?
I have, actually. I've been sitting with Dr. Round for a while now, and he's been very instrumental in like teaching like the right techniques about the trombone and like making me aware of like tendencies that could lead to areas of focal dystonia and areas like that. So he's been very instrumental in like teaching me what to look out for and also like the good habits to practice when developing on the instrument.
Great. So Chris, can you talk about the evaluation of dystonia maybe in general and then specifically for embouchure, like MRI or EMG, or are there special studies to do?
Absolutely. So I'll probably start a little bit more generally, and we'll kind of finish in with kind of an embouchure type of focus here. So typically if a person is having issues with dystonia and maybe they haven't had someone, you know, like a music instructor or someone who kind of knows what it is, they oftentimes will get referred in to see a neurologist with the question of, you know, what is this new abnormal thing? Because we talked about the fact that, you know, we don't typically see structural lesions or damages in the brain, oftentimes other than the movement itself that you'll see on examination, you don't see a lot of other abnormal findings on a person. You still, oftentimes when someone has a new neurologic issue, getting a picture of the brain, like an MRI of the brain, makes sense. Every now and then, people can have small little strokes that can cause a dystonia. That's not very common, and those often aren't quite so focal, aren't quite so unique to a certain behavior, but they can still cause a dystonia. Something like MRIs can be appropriate. When we're talking about neck, sometimes getting things like an EMG, evaluating for some type of nerve impingement can also make sense. There are also some other rare causes of dystonias that can be genetic or inherited, so getting a good family history, and just a basic neurologic evaluation also makes sense to see if there's any other reasons you would want to get blood tests for other certain kind of conditions or diseases. So once you kind of establish a diagnosis of dystonia, you get into this question of what are we going to do about it? And there are kind of three main things you do for dystonias in general. The first is kind of thinking about a physical therapy type of stance. We're thinking about stretches, exercises that improve mobility. Then you get into the question about oral medications. Not all dystonias are as amenable to oral medications as others. And so you're looking at medications that might go back to that question about inhibition. So a lot of our medications that are beneficial for dystonia try to increase inhibition, try to make things less tight, less excitable. That has its own pluses and minuses to it in general. There's other classes of medications as well. And then for some people, there's these injections with something called botulinum toxin. People have heard of Botox. Botox is just one brand of botulinum toxin. There's several of them, but people colloquially will say, oh, Botox, like Kleenex. And what that is, it's a toxin that gets injected into the specific muscles that are causing too much spasms, too much tightness, too much pulling, to try and relax them and try to cause a little bit of less of that abnormal brain signal to get down to the muscles itself. There are some severe forms of dystonias that you actually can do certain brain surgeries for, and something called deep brain stimulation surgery. But those are generally for people who have dystonias that are quite severe, quite impactful, that are precluding their ability to live out a daily life. And so classically, when we think about musicians' dystonia, which embouchure dystonia is a part of, you have different types. You have people who have, playing the piano, maybe it's more of a limb dystonia issue, or maybe with the trombone, it was something with the way that he's doing the slide. You're looking at hands or things like that. Some of those can be amendable to things like botulinum toxin, where you're putting injections in to try and target. Lips are really complex. The ability to create a buzz, to create that tension, trying to potentially do injections with botulinum toxin are very, very difficult. When you look at the literature, it just doesn't work as well. So classically, when we think about embouchure dystonias, you're looking at more of that retraining processes that you were getting at here. And the literature supports early identification is really the way to go. That you start out looking for patients who are maybe having fatigue or they're having cramping or tightness. And if you let that go long enough, people can go on and develop dystonias, and they can be super impactful. They can preclude people or end people's careers. And so trying to identify poor habits early on, the literature supports that's the way you can keep people from progressing onward and having more symptoms, because once people become super symptomatic, it's really hard to pull back from that point. And so, it's a difficult condition, but having the correct mentors and correct advisors to keep track of people, especially when they're young, still developing these new techniques, really helps us to keep people out of my clinic.
There's a famous guitar player who I was able to watch perform who developed it and treated it by switching from playing right-handed to left-handed. And does that make sense with the neuroplasticity?
Yeah, dystonias are these very peculiar things that one type of movement can be completely affected where something cannot. There's a whole cadre of these focal dystonias with chopsticks, where someone can do everything except chopsticks. Typing or writing or things like that. And so just because you get some sort of abnormal cramping or posturing in your left hand doing one certain task doesn't necessarily mean that if you switched it over to the other side that it couldn't potentially pick. And so it is very peculiar. I think of it almost, dystonia falls almost kind of like apps on your cell phone. That it's not that your whole phone is broken, it's that your one certain app on your phone becomes abnormal and broken. And as opposed to our phones where we can uninstall and reinstall, you can't quite do the exact same process with the brain.
So it's my understanding that musicians' hand dystonia is something that Botox can be helpful for, but embouchure dystonia is maybe a different category because of the complexities of the lip?
Yeah, absolutely. It's just less amendable to the potential of doing it. It's not to say that people haven't tried, but when you look at the literature, it just doesn't have the same amount of success as some other types of musicians' dystonia.
Do you have some more insights, Jonathan, about dystonia based on Chris's great presentation?
I appreciate hearing that. I've read some of the literature in my own kind of experience, try to find an answer, but that all seems to make sense to me. I knew that right from the beginning and did a little research that the Botox injections weren't successful, not particularly helpful. My understanding with all the different people I worked with was that people that tend to be more anxious or depressed have a really hard time retraining. And so that could be like a part of it. And if they weren't before, when they developed dystonia, they certainly are then, because a part of your livelihood, your sense of self-worth, and a large part of your identity are tied up in being a musician. So you can develop social anxiety or performance anxieties that can be kind of coupled with that as well. So kind of a combined approach, sometimes with maybe a therapy, possibly anti-anxiety medications, whatever, but then also retraining exercises. Again, I'm a trombonist. I'm not a medical doctor, so to a grain of salt. But it seems like from talking with other people and things like that, some combination of that, depending on the individual, could be helpful.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly what the literature supports as well. And the other things that people ask about sometimes, the idea like, have I overtrained too young? Do they start too young? Things like that. And what's interesting is that when you look at, again, across the spectrum of these data, where they take professional musicians and they, question them about their symptoms, starting really young versus starting older isn't really as much of the issue. In fact, they see more in people who maybe start older in life, and then they just pound out the hours of training, maybe in their teens or 20s, as opposed to starting younger and gradually developing over time. And so it seemed like the musicians who started later in life and just put in huge amounts of time at that later time were actually a little bit more likely to develop a dystonia than maybe someone who started early in life and just kind of aggregated years of experience instead of trying to just slam it all into a short period of time.
Thank you, Colby. That was a terrific performance. Additional detail regarding this and other episodes of Music and Medicine on Monday can be accessed by visiting the Iowa protocols through the QR code displayed, our website address, or simply by searching on the web for Iowa Protocols, Music and Medicine on Monday.